So hello everybody and welcome to this edition of the asiCast, and I'm delighted to say that today's edition, well, I'm joined by Nick Manning. Nick Manning is, I'm sure, known to very many of you. He was the founder of a famous media agency called Manning Gottlieb, which subsequently was sold to Omnicom, and Nick then became the CEO of the Omnicom media agencies here in the UK. And Manning Gottlieb indeed still is very much a force in UK advertising as part of the Omnicom group. Nick had various roles after that. I mean, the most notable of which I suspect was that he was Chief Strategy Officer at the consulting business Ubiquity. And for the last few years, he's been a critic and a vocal commentator as an independent consultant. So hi there, Nick.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to join you.
Absolutely, our pleasure, I can say. Right, Nick, you wrote a piece, which is what really started the discussion that we're going to have today on the media leader site on the 22nd of May, which I think was entitled something like "The Online Advertising Bubble Has Burst."
Yeah.
And you were making the point, of course, which is, of course, both very fair and extremely true, that both Vice and BuzzFeed are two examples of sites funded by online advertising that have had very serious financial trouble. And is this, you were articulating, is this an indication that the online ad bubble has burst? The point is, of course, though, that the share taken of total advertising onto online channels is still continuing to grow. So do you think that Vice and BuzzFeed, which were the two that you quoted, are kind of an isolated incident, or do you think there's a sort of greater shifting of the tectonic plates, as it were, towards more quality and independent media?
Well, they weren't the first. I mean, we've seen a lot of mastheads, in inverted commas, go from being published in print format to go digital. Some have even been closed down. So there's been attrition for quite a long time. I think the point about BuzzFeed and Vice is that they are the most outstanding examples of companies that represented supposedly the height of the internet frenzy. They were both valued at several $1 billion of value. Not so very long ago, they were the darlings of the industry. Everybody said it was going to be the future of news. And of course, that's no longer the true. The bubble has definitely burst. I mean, the valuations of many companies in the sector have declined. If you look at the article, it talks about the fact that most of the ad tech companies who IPO'd in that 2019 to 2021 period are significantly down versus their IP float price, some of them 90% down, and not all of them would survive. And we've seen this week that Viant and MediaMath are looking to get together, for example. So I think it's fair to say that while they may be the poster child, Vice and BuzzFeed, the truth is that we've come to the end of a 20-year run when the internet was the only game in town. Advertising was going to be an unlimited source of funding for the internet, although obviously other people have got hybrid models and subscription-only models. But it's been 20 years-ish that there seemed to be this unlimited amount of advertising money funding internet-based media properties, and I think we definitely have come to the end of that period now. It was a bubble, which is why so many companies are now well below their original value. And the question really is, if we are at a crossroads, where do we go from here? And I see it as an opportunity as much as anything else to reset the dials on some of the things that haven't been so great about the last 20 years.
So you would reset the dial more towards sort of quality, I would imagine, because I mean, just taking our own little world here in the UK, we've got the Telegraph titles being put up for sale. Although it's fair to point out that's nothing to do with the financial performance of the Telegraph titles, which I believe are doing perfectly well. And I think they're up in the 20, 30, 40 million pound a year profit level. But anyway, they're being put up for sale. They seem to have built a pretty successful sort of subscription model. I think it's about 750,000 subscribers they've now got, which is still bad. And I'm sort of wondering whether or not, the Telegraph, I suppose, is an example of a good old sort of quality newspaper, which seems to be able to attract subscribers into this hybrid model. I mean, do you see that as an indication that, to support your case against the online online providers.
Well, I think the truth is that if the quality is good enough, there are people out there who will want to pay for it. And you and I may not be Daily Telegraph types of people, although one of my secret pleasures is I do subscribe to the Daily Telegraph online, mostly for the comments below the articles, but that's another story. But I mean, there are many media owners like the Financial Times and others, Netflix and in the broadcast area, who have demonstrated that they can have successful models based on high quality content that people are prepared to pay for. And advertising is not an unlimited is not in unlimited supply. I mean, we've ridden a wave over the last several years really since the crash of advertising growing back again and being in plentiful supply, but it isn't any longer. It's also been spread in some ways too thinly, but on the other hand, far too much of it has flown into a small number of places, notably Meta and Google, and now TikTok, Amazon, I suppose you could add in there as well. So on the one hand, you've got so many people chasing advertising money, and so much of it going into just a small number of places. There simply wasn't enough to go around. And it was okay while the advertising market was relatively strong, but now that it's in advertising in something of its own recession, the advertising spigot has stopped, producing, and as a result, to use the Buffett analogy, the tide's gone out, and everyone can now see who was swimming naked. So we will see more. We will see more closures and mergers and changes because the advertising revenue is no longer there that it was before.
I was going to say, extraordinary thing. Sorry? I was just going to say, just an extraordinary thing. If you listen to financial advisors and VCs and PEs and all those sorts of people, there does seem to be this sort of belief that advertising is somehow elastic. That there's an unlimited supply of advertising, and that somebody new comes along and they will just somehow or other generate from some unseen sort of unknown lake of money that's hidden away.
Well, in a way, that was the case because the source of the money that was funding the internet was print and to a certain extent television and other media. So there was this massive, displacement of money from the older media types into the new media types. But that's not happening anymore either. There isn't really, that displacement has happened. So that has happened, but also there's not much new money coming into the advertising marketplace. But I would also contend that so much of this was driven by the sense from advertisers that they had to invest in digital properties, almost irrespective of the fact whether they were working or not. And in many instances, I believe they probably couldn't tell, but digital was everything because that was where the people were going and the money followed suit. And I think to a certain extent over the last 20 years, people have investing in digital properties without necessarily knowing whether it was a good investment or not. And so often, it was difficult to tell. But I just sort of caveat this and say that not all digital properties are the same. I think search, for example, has completely different dynamics and is much easier to quantify and validate, whereas the walled gardens, have worked for many small to medium businesses, but not so much the big players. But online display advertising, which was the main focus of the article that you're referring to, has been the source of a tremendous loss of value to advertisers for many, many years. And it's not just what thinks that. All the studies there have been back to 2014 with the WFA and the ANA in 2016 and PwC twice recently, all say pretty much the same thing. Just in terms of the transactional costs, leaving aside issues like viewability and fraud and so on and so forth. So enormous destruction of value during that period of time has been sustained by advertisers to the benefit of the intermediary market. And that has lasted a very, very long time. And it has to be said that it's a good thing that it's starting to break down now. And in Cannes, in 2 weeks' time, the top line results from the latest ANA study will come out. And if I were a gambling man, I would say that it'll probably tell a similar story.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, I mean, ad spend levels always used to be kind of linked in some way, didn't they? Directly linked actually to audience numbers.
Yeah.
So, produce the audience, bring in the money kind of thing. But given the opacity of, how much fraud there is around, given how much lack of validated data there is around in some of the walled gardens and so on, that link, it would seem to me, has been somewhat broken. I mean, you've now got, people spending money apparently to reach people, but actually a lot of the time to reach something else other than people, be it bots or other fraudulent.
Yeah, well, I mean, the truth. I mean, it's very simple, and I've been saying this for a number of years now. But the currency that was invented to fund the internet advertising model was impressions, which everybody for some reason seemed to think was audience. It really isn't. It's got nothing to do with audience. It's a machine-to-machine transaction. And there was no, very little sort of data attached to those impressions that actually looked like an audience. I mean, people have tried in various ways to attach, third-party data, first-party data, sometimes second, to make it more audience-like. But the truth is that the people have been buying on an impressions basis. And if that is true, and it was true, the more impressions that could be manufactured, the more money flows to whoever's manufacturing them. And some of those impressions were genuine, people actually doing what people do. But of course, it was in everybody's interest to manufacture artificial impressions as well, because they attracted money too. And the difficulty that everyone's had is actually telling the difference between a good old-fashioned human impression, adding in viewability and so on, now more recently attention, and bots and fraud and, bot farms. You can buy traffic on the internet. You don't know where you're getting it from, but you can buy it. But there's a lack of audience data that's the problem, because it's impressions are not an audience.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think you also made, I know you also made the point, I mean, if not in this article, but it's somewhere else I read, that, it always used to be, didn't it, that advertising and the whole business of advertising was done for the benefit of advertisers. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what it was for. I mean, you produced an ad in order to make more money for the advertiser or do something or other for the advertiser. But of course, that was in the days, I suppose, when you had a kind of limited supply of, of channels in order to reach an audience. And therefore, almost by definition, it made an awful lot of sense to go out and buy audience. That was exactly what we all used to do. As soon as you take away that, as soon as you make the supply completely unlimited, then the whole thing seems to me to sort of break down, and advertising becomes a revenue stream rather than anything else. It's not much to do with that.
Well, the programmatic trading was not invented by advertisers. No. It was invented by publishers and the ad tech industry as a way of clearing a vast amount of inventory. Now, and again, without wishing to be too simplistic, if you're a publisher and you used to publish daily or weekly, you had a certain amount of inventory to fill, and you had ways of filling that. But if you're a publisher and you're publishing every day, and you've got advertising inventory to fill every day, in fact, every hour, even every minute, then you find ways of doing that, which is why the ad networks got set up in the first place as a clearinghouse for excess inventory. And of course, everybody, because that worked, everybody piled in. The ad tech industry was built to service it. The ad tech companies, many of them were making vast profits out of it, whether they were the supply side platforms, the demand side platforms, even the content verification companies, data providers. There were a huge number of snouts in the trough, none of whom were adding a tremendous amount of value in some instances to client business. Some yes, some no, but it's difficult whether they were telling whether they were or not. So the industry's become led by the demand side of things, including the great powers that are Google and Meta and so on. Whereas what you've been describing and what I talk about is the fact that when we were young people, everything we did was in the interests of the advertiser, and everybody else was subsidiary to that. They were downstream, and their job was to make advertising work harder. It's now worked the other way, whereas advertising is there to fund media. And without too many questions asked. And the trouble is that too many media properties have been making very, very good money indeed, without being accountable for it in terms of its advertising effectiveness. And if PwC are right, and 50% of the money goes into that transactional chain before it reaches the publisher. And if it's true to say that viewability is roughly 60% even after that, and fraud is another 20%, then advertisers are lucky if they see 20 cents in the dollar actually doing something. And there's no question some advertisers have made it work for them. I'm sure they could have made it work harder if so much value weren't lost. But for big advertisers, it's been very hard to tell. And it's quite notable how few case studies there are anywhere in the world for large brands who have made online display advertising work very hard for them.
It's rather interesting, actually. That's a very good point. It's rather interesting that if you go back in the history of the ASI used to have one particular speaker, John Philip Jones, who did an awful lot. You probably remember, who did a great deal of work for Procter and Gamble. Now, I remember John standing up at an ASI way back in the distant past and sharing with us some results from Procter and Gamble's first tentative steps in those days into online advertising, and his conclusion was really pretty simple, which was this just doesn't work for us. I mean, it might work for someone else, but it doesn't work for flogging soap powder. It just doesn't. Not appropriate. It's not working. And yet, as you said, I mean, everyone did sort of pile in, and I think we're much worse off as a result. I mean, I think it's worked very nicely for certain types of advertiser, what we used to call perhaps DR advertisers.
Performance-based advertising.
Performance-based advertisers is absolutely great, but if you're trying to be a brand-building advertiser, if you are a brand-building advertiser relying upon power of advertising to build your brand, this has not been a great golden era.
No, and I think there's this is the point at which some people out there would stand and say, "Oh, yes, you're anti-digital," which is a phrase that's been used very recently about people like myself. And I kind of go, well, that's a bit like saying you're anti-food or anti-air. Not anti anything. I mean, because there are lots and lots of different types of digital media, digital television, digital outdoor, digital, newspapers, if you like. So it's not about being anti-digital per se. It's about saying, is it working? Is it doing for the advertiser what the advertiser needs? And that can be effectiveness in terms of sales. It can be changing people's attitudes. If for some advertisers, it could be simply just building the brand. And one of the things that I like about Bob Hoffman, and I know that you've spent quite a lot of time talking to him, is he strips all of it away and says, you know what, the thing that really makes brands tick in brand communication terms is fame. And we've been talking about this since the 70s, 80s. I mean, fame was always and still is the main way to build brands. And the nature of digital media is it's not a particularly good, some of the digital media channels are not particularly good at driving fame. And they actually sort of said, well, look, we're not about that. We're about precision. We're about personalization, and we're about personalization at scale, so that if Brian Jacobs sees an ad but Nick Manning doesn't see an ad, then Brian is more likely to respond to it, blah, 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 blah. And the truth is that's proven to be something of a myth in my view. And the reality is, and I'm sure Byron Sharp has phrased it differently, but the reality is, if you want to grow a brand, the best way to do that is through making it famous and shared and public. And some digital channels are not very good at that. The ones that are the better at it, like YouTube, don't do it as well as others do. TikTok could do it for certain audiences, for certain brands. So it's not like it's all bad or all good. It's just that I think people have been quite unadventurous in some ways in trying to work out what actually works for them. And money has flown into these channels almost irrespective of whether they were actually working or not, which is the antithesis of how we used to do things back in the good or bad old days, whichever way you look.
Bad old days. I mean, I've talked to Bob, as you said, I've talked to Bob quite a lot about this. And one of the questions I've always asked Bob Hoffman is, it seems to me, I mean, if you take Facebook, and nothing pro or against Facebook, but if you take Facebook as a channel, it just seems to me that most ads on Facebook just aren't terribly good. Now, that could be because no one's quite worked out how best to do ads on Facebook. They've worked out how to do ads in a performance sense, But if you're going to use a channel as huge as Facebook to build brands, then you probably need to do something a little bit different from what we traditionally have done. It's like saying, it's like back in the day when we used to say, well, you can't put a newspaper out on a poster. It just doesn't work. I mean, it's a different channel, it's a different way of consuming it. And I wonder whether or not, and I've asked Bob this question, I wonder why it is that we don't seem to have got to grips with how best to advertise on these things. We just do what we do.
Yeah, I think there's a degree of that. I mean, obviously, there's been an attempt to try and broaden the inventory model to include a lot more video, for example, and TikTok is a good example of that. So is Facebook, actually. But the reality is that the formats available, the way people are using them, the way people tend to think of advertising as being primarily a sort of direct response performance medium in many instances, it means that it's very difficult to build a brand and build brand fame through the use of certain digital channels. And because there are so many of them and the audience is so fragmented, then you don't even know how many people you're really reaching. And because there's quite a lot of leakage in terms of non-human traffic or poor viewability, then you also don't even know whether your advertising has even scored. It hasn't registered. I mean, most of our training when we were young media planners was to work out whether the advertising was even seen on, which you just can't do in most digital channels. You have to take it on trust. And the trouble is, you shouldn't take it on trust, because the reality is that so much of it is not seen by human audiences. And if it is seen by human audiences, sometimes for a very minimal period of time. And the MRC definition of viewability has been around now for, I'm going to say 15 years, I don't know, but at least that. 1 second for static advertising and 2 seconds for video advertising, which was always a bit of a nonsense, has never really been seriously challenged.
Yeah, I mean, okay, let's just end this by asking you a very direct question, Nick. I mean, if you were the advertising model at the moment, we've all agreed, seems to be broken for the majority of people who are using it. People don't want to admit that for all sorts of perfectly understandable reasons, but the fact is it's not working terribly well at the moment. Now, most people, I think, agree that the most powerful medium kind of ever invented really was television, or is television. So if you were a broadcaster and you were selling television advertising today, in the midst of all this noise going around about online advertising and digital advertising and all the rest of it, if you were them, what would you be focusing on? What would you do?
Well, I would do what they have been doing for ever and a day, really, is I would say that, there is unlimited amount of evidence that audio visual advertising, which is an expression I hate, but everyone uses it because they're trying to say it's not just broadcast TV or linear TV. Television, to give its proper title, is still the best medium at driving brand fame. If it is the right kind of messaging, in other words, you can't say that just because you're on television, it's going to be successful, because the wrong messaging can do that. To reach the right number of people, i.e., ideally en masse, and it doesn't have to be everybody, but it can be a subset of everybody, and to do it in a way that commands attention and is seen and heard. All those things. And, if you talk to EGTA or any of the other major players in the market, Thinkbox is a good example in the UK, those are the messages that they pump out all the time. The problem is that there's still this degree of, yes, but all the eyeballs, all the people, all the young, consumers now are spending most of their day on TikTok. A lot of people are on Amazon, and so on. You just still feel a little bit sort of like a bit of a dinosaur if you talk about the virtues of fame, brand fame, and good old-fashioned television advertising, which, by the way, can be YouTube and it can even be TikTok. Although, again, we get into conversations about equivalences here, because a 30-second ad on a mainstream TV channel is not the same as a 6-second ad on Facebook or a video on TikTok. So, I know what the ASI does, and what the ASI does is we need that more and more to try and bring some kind of common sense into the marketplace, so that media are evaluated correctly against their strengths. So I would carry on doing exactly what they have been doing for ever and a day, because hopefully in the end, those messages will start getting through. So as we move into this new era where after 20 years, the internet bubble is bursting or has burst, then hopefully there will be a swing back towards the quality of exposure, the power of messaging, creativity, effectiveness, and even good old-fashioned reach, which, by the way, has been misused a lot because people say coverage is the same as reach and reach is the same as coverage. So if Facebook say we've got fantastic reach, well, actually, this means you've got a lot of users. It's not the same thing. So to answer, that's a very long answer to a short question, but I would just keep banging that drum and get more people to bang that drum, because in the end, I think we know we're right.
Yeah, in the end, the good guys win. Nick, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for joining us for this edition of the asiCast.
Well, it's been a great pleasure. We could talk about this all day long, but we probably shouldn't. And but I do think it's well, we know it's a debate that needs to be had. Fortunately, it's starting to be had. Some of the trade titles are getting behind it. So the media leader people, AdWanted, are going to be talking about this at their conference in October. So I think there's a bit of a groundswell. I think the move towards attention is partially evidence of this as well, and very welcome it is too. And I love the work that people like Mike and Karen are doing in that area. So I think there are good signs of some progress being made. I hope so anyway.
Thanks, Nick.
Okay, pleasure. Thank you very much.